Everybody, and this is a nice cozy little group here, so that we can have a good conversation. I was going to take time to open my computer to something that I was going to look up, but that's okay. We can skip that. Briefly, let me just say that to sum up my idea, and then I expand on it a little after that. Civil society, there are two ways of looking at it. In terms of its role in revolutionary transitional times, societies that are transitioning but that are experiencing turmoil in their transition. The role of civil society in such cases tends to be one of mobilizing and tends to be one that is directly involved in the turmoil. Whereas the role of civil society in more normal times, in politically and economically developed countries, say in Europe and the US these days, the role of civil society is more normal, less involved in turmoil, and more engaged in what are considered to be the normal functions of civil society, which is advocacy for special interests and performing actual services for the population or that segment of the population which they represent. Morocco is somewhere in between the two. Morocco is a transitional society, however, it is not experiencing turmoil or revolutionary transition. At the same time, Morocco is not quite where it wants to be. It's still in transition towards a more normal, fully developed, politically and economically developed society. So, in that case, civil society in Morocco plays a very important role in helping that transition along, and at the same time in absorbing some of the revolutionary energy, so that it doesn't cause turmoil, but it causes progress. This is in a nutshell where I place Moroccan civil society. In general, the definition of civil society is that these are groups, clusters of groups, that form voluntarily. In other words, this is not something you inherit by birth. This is not something you get from your religion. These are usually secular groups that get together around a certain idea or around a certain interest, and therefore they represent that interest, that group, and they advocate for it. They also serve as a watchdog. The principal definitions of civil society involve, or they estimate that civil society plays an important role of helping society avoid tyranny. They help citizens rely on themselves and perform certain functions for themselves, so they don't have to rely on government to perform it for them. But also, they act as a watchdog, which means they observe the government and they make sure that the government is living up to its obligations towards its citizens. And when they find that the government is not doing so, then they point that out. In normal societies, in normal ways, within the mainstream political life of the country, and not in revolutionary ways. Now, what happened in the Middle East in general, in the MENA region? Civil society in the 90s, starting from 1990, and for 10 years after that. Civil society, as well as social media, as well as the spread of the internet. The Middle East was a black hole. If you looked at the whole globe and you lit up the areas where civil society was active and the internet was spreading fast, the Middle East wasn't there. However, in year 2000 and on, this picture starts to change. It changes dramatically and it changes quickly. So that today, internet, social media, is higher than average in the Middle East and the rest of the world. So the Middle East is now doing very well in terms of electronic connectivity and in terms of internet and social media. And these are very important corollaries of civil society. Now, what happened in 2011, what many people refer to as the Arab Spring and which I refer to as the Arab uprisings. It is in the singular because there's a common thread. What started in Tunisia spread very quickly to Yemen and then Egypt and then Libya and then Syria. So it was the same phenomenon. So I don't say uprisings, but one uprising. And the theme was a common theme. And the slogans were similar slogans. This had a lot to do with the social media and the spread of electronic connectivity. So the social media and internet did not cause the Arab uprising, but they facilitated it and made it easier and helped it to move along in a quicker way. Because in those societies, in those 4 countries that I mentioned, are the countries where they had an actual uprising with turmoil, with varying degrees of violence, and where the head of state was overthrown or changed because of it. In those societies, civil society organizations, the NGOs, played a mobilizing role. They engaged, they were the spark that caused this uprising. So even in places where the internet wasn't completely covering the whole country, what these people did was start connecting with one another and with other groups on the internet, but then by word of mouth, mobilized the rest of the population. These large, huge crowds in the streets and in public squares were instigated by a small group of young people. Instead of civil society, you often hear the word youth. The youth of the Arab world started this in Egypt, this in Tunisia, etc. But what they're referring to, the youth didn't just spontaneously and in a disorganized way come out into the streets. They were organized and instigated and sparked by civil society in their countries. So in terms of the positive force for change, these civil society groups played an important role, because without them probably this wouldn't have happened. Some people say this is negative, I wish it had never happened. Well, actually, change is for the good, even if it doesn't appear to be for the good right away. In a negative way, for civil society, they're playing the role of a mobilizing force was a bit negative for them, because that's not a natural role for civil society. They become involved in the turmoil and they become politicized by the turmoil. And therefore you see groups in Egypt that, whereas they had not been political before, once the uprising took place, they started lining up, okay, Mubarak has left, now what do we do? Who do we elect and what direction do we take? They started going with one candidate. One group goes with April 6th, went with one candidate. Kifaya and other groups went with other presidential hopefuls. And therefore, they started acting a little bit like a political party. And that's not a normal activity for civil society. There's always a political aspect to civil society work, but they're not supposed to be themselves seeking authority, seeking power, or supporting one candidate against another. That's not a normal function. But that's what happened in Egypt, as well as in the other countries that I mentioned. The other negative part is that in those societies where turmoil led to the overthrow of the head of state, when it happened a little too quickly. And therefore, civil society itself was not prepared for what came after the deposition of the head of state. And what they did was unleash other more traditional forces in these countries, tribal, political, military, etc. And now you find that in all these cases, Syria being a special case, of course, because a very bloody civil war is continuing right now, so it's not the right time to talk about civil society in Syria. But in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, the groups that got together to discuss the future of their countries did not give a commensurate role for the youth and for the civil society groups that sparked these revolutionary uprisings in the first place. So today in Yemen, for example, you find the tribes dominate, and political parties dominate, and the youth and their civil society associations are playing a more minor role. They're searching for the proper role to play in developing and helping to develop the future of their countries. Morocco, special case. First of all, in that Moroccan civil society started earlier than anywhere else in the region. Starting from 1990, Moroccan civil society took off very quickly and soon became the most active and the most extensive in its spread, in the width and in the depth of their activities. Moroccan civil society groups, in my opinion, are the best in the region, the best in MENA region. In fact, when I left Morocco to go to other countries, Iraq and then Yemen, I always talked to civil society there and told them, meet with your Moroccan counterparts and learn from their experience. There's a lot that they can share with you. Now, why was that special? Because by the time the uprising season started in 2011, Morocco had its own spark. In the February 20 movement, a new generation, much younger than the one that started civil society in 1990, wanted to play a role similar to youth, the roles played by the youth in the other countries. Two things made Morocco different and made Morocco take a different path, which is a more peaceful path and one that involves reform from above. And one was the way the king reacted to the uprising, which is he took a very early positive response to it, said, I understand, and I'm going to propose certain changes, and immediately these changes were announced. There was a new constitution, serious amendments to the old constitution, and therefore people felt like this was the first Arab leader to directly learn from the experience of others in the region, the negative experiences, and say, I'm going to do this differently. The second, which people don't realize, everybody realizes that the king in Morocco played a different role, a more positive one. What people don't realize is that civil society, the well-established groups in Morocco, played an equally important role, which is they did not mobilize. They did not play a revolutionary role. They advocated a more evolutionary role. And they went to the young people who, in the February 20 movement, for example, and others, and counseled them to work with the government, with the monarch, rather than against them. Therefore, the civil society established groups in Morocco played a more normal function, which is we are working on reforms with the government, not against the government. And this also absorbed a lot of the revolutionary energy which was there among young people in Morocco. But it absorbed it and it channeled it into more positive directions. And this is something that Moroccans should be aware of, and people in the region, in the MENA region, should be aware of, and should thank civil society in Morocco for, and should work with them, and learn from their experience and help them continue to play that role. Now, very quickly, there are serious challenges ahead for Morocco in the question-answer period. We can get into that, which is on all the indices, the international NGOs, the World Bank, the IMF, Freedom House, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all these serious international organizations, that evaluate the progress, political and economic development of countries, and they rank them. They are all critical of the distance that remains between where Morocco is today and where it should be. They acknowledge progress in human rights, in civil rights, in economic development. But Morocco remains, if you classify it among the countries of the world, average or just below average on political and civil liberties, for example, on human rights, on GDP and GDP per capita. So despite the significant economic progress, there remains serious poverty in Morocco. Despite progress on employment, there remains, particularly among the youth, the youth don't do well at all proportionally in terms of the overall employment rates among the population. The corruption is a very important problem. Economic corruption, but also corruption of the institutions as well, such as the judiciary. These are areas that the authorities should recognize, and they should work hand in hand with Moroccan civil society, which has the expertise and has the international connections to help drive the progress faster in Morocco on all these criteria. And that's where I think the greatest potential role for Moroccan civil society is. I'm happy to see that Morocco now has a minister who liaises, connects, not just with parliament, but with civil society organizations. This is a recognition of the important role that civil society plays in Moroccan development. And I hope that this continues in a serious way, and that the civil society organizations are listened to and appreciated, and that their experience spreads throughout the MENA region. Thank you very much.